Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we're doing another top 10 video. This time, top 10 types of ships I wish had been preserved, or wish will be preserved in some cases. We have done a previous top 10 video where I talked about the 10 specific ships I wanted to see preserved as museum ships, and today is a much more nebulous. I'm not going to say I specifically want this ship or that ship. Just going to lament the fact that none of X entire type of ship was salvaged as a museum. These picks are not in any particular order. I just wrote down the 10 types of ships that I would have really liked to see preserved. So, first off, any sort of World War II era cruiser. We have the cruiser Little Rock, which is in Buffalo, New York. And she is a World War II era Cleveland-class cruiser that has been modernized to carry missiles. So she is in a more Cold War configuration. We also have the cruiser Salem in Quincy, Massachusetts, and she is very much a World War II design, World War II influenced, and in a lot of ways, going through her is a lot more similar to going through a World War II era ship than going through a ship like Little Rock or even New Jersey, which is in a much modernized configuration. However, Salem is a post-war construction. There were so many important World War II cruisers, and none of them were preserved. We had the German heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which would have made a very interesting museum ship. She was basically the last Kriegsmarine warship, the last major warship from the Kriegsmarine afloat, but we expended her in nuclear tests instead of using her as a museum. The Germans used cruisers extensively as raiders throughout the war, so it would have been a compelling object. Japan used cruisers extensively throughout the war, and I can only think of a single light cruiser that survived the war, although there were a number that were sunk in port near the end of the war, including their excellent heavy cruisers. I think Japan built the best heavy cruisers of World War II between their guns and torpedo armament and search plane capabilities. The United States ends the war with a number of pre-war cruisers that had seen a lot of service, as well as a number of Baltimore and Cleveland class cruisers that would then go on to serve for a number of years, and yet none of these were preserved. I think the biggest issue here is battleships have name recognition. Battleship New Jersey, the entire state of New Jersey can support that vessel. So that's why most of the preserved battleships are in their home state, preserved by their entire state. Cruisers, though being much lighter, are very similar in size to battleship. However, they are named after a city, typically in American service, and usually a lesser person or geographic area in foreign service than their battleships. And so you get less support for making one a museum ship and supporting one as a museum. Next up for me, I've got 4-stacker destroyers. In the book, Flush Deckers and Four Pipers, that author calls the 4-stack destroyers the most uniquely and iconically American ships ever built. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but their historical significance cannot be argued, and they sure look unique. Now, I'm a huge fan of the 4-stack destroyers, and they are clearly a class of ship that resonates with the public. That you've got the series of books, Destroyermen, set on 4-stack destroyers. They show up a lot in other books as well. And these ships really held the line when the United States entered World War I. They did a lot of the early submarine hunting in that war. During Prohibition, the Coast Guard operated a number of 4-stack destroyers in operations against rum runners. And then during World War II, both the United States and a number of other countries, allied countries, and even Japan operated 4-stack destroyers. And so these ships held the line during the early Battle of the Atlantic, with 50 going to Great Britain, and the United States operating another roughly 100 of these vessels during that war. So this was a huge class of ships. They are relatively small and therefore would be restorable, but none survive in their original configuration. There were a couple sold to South American countries to be used as merchants, and they were heavily cut down. And there are a couple whose wrecks are still out there off the coast of California. There are some that are partially afloat. However, none of these were preserved. Not only would I have these on my list of ships that should have been preserved, but it's also on my list of ships that I would rebuild if I had infinite money to rebuild a compelling vessel. Next up on my list, I have a conventional supercarrier. So the Midway class are the last of the World War II designed and earlier fleet carriers. And then after that, the United States goes into supercarriers, starting with the Forrestal class. These earlier supercarriers are conventionally powered. They've got steam plants like Battleship New Jersey. Enterprise, and then later the Nimitz and Ford class carriers, are also supercarriers of similar size, but they go over to nuclear propulsion. And ships with nuclear propulsion pose all sorts of issues in being converted to museums. So if we want a supercarrier to be opened as a museum, we're limited to the conventional carriers. Ships like the Constellation Kitty Hawk or any of the 4 Forrestal class, or even the John F. Kennedy here at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. A number of organizations formed to try and save one or another of these supercarriers as museum ships in various places around the country. However, these ships are all significantly larger in both length and displacement compared to an Iowa-class battleship. So the needs for restoring them are astronomical. The money you would need for them is also astronomical. And so the Navy, possibly rightly so, set a very high bar for what it would take to acquire one of these vessels. And none of the organizations, despite years of efforts, were able to match the Navy's requirements. The requirements that the existing museum ships faced are less than this. So the Homeport Alliance for Battleship New Jersey did not have to meet those same high requirements. If they had of, there's a good chance Battleship New Jersey wouldn't have been saved. However, again, Battleship New Jersey has the full backing of the state of New Jersey. An aircraft carrier like Kitty Hawk, she is named after a specific city, in this instance because of the Wright brothers flying there. That's why that name was chosen. So you don't have the broad backing coming behind that name. Likewise, Saratoga, named after the battle. Forrestal, named after an individual. Constellation, named after the older constellations, which were named after the stars on the American flag, basically. So that there's much less backing there. You still see thousands and thousands of sailors serve on these ships throughout pretty much 5-decade careers for all of them. And so there is a lot of backing, but it's not as broad as an entire geographic area coming behind these ships to choose. You've got sailors from John F. Kennedy who are on the West Coast. You've got sailors from John F. Kennedy on the East Coast. How do you bring those people together and decide we're going to restore that ship in one area? And so after years of not being able to meet the criteria, all of the supercarriers have been removed from donation hold status and are being scrapped in Brownsville, Texas as quickly as slipways open up. Right now, only Kitty Hawk on the West Coast and Kennedy on the East Coast have not been towed to Brownsville to start the scrapping process. However, those ships will be soon. The only reason why at least one of them hasn't been scrapped already is probably because Bonhomme Richard was towed down there to be scrapped, and that was not a planned evolution. This is following the devastating fire on board while she was going through a yard period earlier this year. Next up, some sort of light aircraft carrier. In my top 10 ships that should have been saved, I specifically mentioned USS Cabot because the process was started with that vessel. But the light carriers, many of which were built right here in Camden, New Jersey, really held the line during World War II when we couldn't get enough fleet carriers out there fast enough. And by this, I also would refer to the escort carriers, which really turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic when we converted merchant hulls into relatively small capacity, slow-moving aircraft carriers that were perfect for forming hunter-killer groups hunting German U-boats and ferrying aircraft across the broad expanses of the Pacific. So these types of ships really did yeoman work throughout World War II. They served with both the United States and Great Britain during the war and a number of other countries post-war. Cabot being sold to Spain, France operating at least one. So these ships are interesting and compelling and were broadly used, and yet no example of them survives today. We have 5 fleet carriers, 4 of them World War II era, 1 of them immediate post-war construction. A British battleship. Man, oh man. Any British battleship. The Royal Navy was the leader in battleship construction. They built more than any other country. Great Britain is a maritime power, and yet their number of museum ships pales in comparison to the United States. And in particular, the number of World War I and World War II era museum ships are laughably low. I can think of, what was it, the M23, I believe it is the Monitor that they've restored, World War I era Monitor, and Caroline, the light cruiser from Jutland. In World War II, you've got the cruiser Belfast, another light cruiser, but they didn't save any of their battleships. Duke of York sinks Scharnhorst, hugely significant. HMS Dreadnought, if she had been saved, shoot, I might not be working here. I might be living in the United Kingdom. Vanguard was around longer than any other British battleship. She probably had the best chance of being saved. Iron Duke, rad name for a battleship. Jellicoe's flagship during the Battle of Jutland, is preserved post-war as a training ship and survives World War II. Like, she would have been an amazing ship to restore. The battle cruiser Renown, it was the most decorated of all the British battleships. So you've got tons of options to choose from. If only Great Britain's economic issues post-World War II had been less and they had been able to maybe keep some of these ships in service long enough for them to make it to the age of museum ships in the later 20th century when many of these ships start to be opened. Hugely devastating loss that none of them were saved. Next up on my list, I have third-rate ships of the line. Older sailing ships are not particularly well represented because of their age and the fact that wood rots and they've been obsolete for over 150 years at this point. However, we've got a fair number of frigates and sloops of war out there, and we've got a first-class ship of the line in HMS Victory. However, I cannot think of a single third-rate ship of the line. These ships, while first-rate would have over 100 guns, a second-rate would have about 90, a third-rate would have in the 70s. These ships were really the core of the line of battle. They had maneuverability more approaching the smaller frigates, but still enough protection and firepower to stand in the line against second and first-rate ships. And they were a little bit smaller and easier to man, so you could make more of them to form a more powerful line of battle. And yet none of these vessels survived. Even the United States built close to a dozen of these vessels to make their own line of battle. These are really the first line of battleships that the United States operates. These ships are hugely significant during the Napoleonic Wars and all of those major early colonial world wars, and yet none exist. And some did survive until the 20th century, only to be scuttled or allowed to rot away or burn next to the pier. Next up on my list, literally any Axis warship. They say history is written by the victor, and in this instance, we only have surviving warships from the victorious powers. Some Axis warships survived the war. I've already talked about Prince Eugen as a possible heavy cruiser inclusion, the Japanese battleship Nagato. There were a number of other Japanese, German, even Italian ships that survived the war. Italy had some operating battleships post-World War II, although technically they joined the Allies mid-war, but still, none of their ships survived to the present day. The United States basically oversees the wholesale scuttling or scrapping of the Japanese Navy prior to giving them a very small number of our used World War II ships as part of their maritime self-defense forces, and then they build off of that to create the very powerful, the very regionally powerful modern maritime self-defense force that they operate today, which is all indigenously built in Japan. They don't take, they don't need foreign ships anymore like they did after World War II. So there were a number of options there, and it's very disappointing to me that our historical record is so one-sided with these surviving artifacts. Really, it's more one-sided than that, because even looking at European allies, you don't see many. It's basically just American World War II era warships that have survived in any sort of number to give you any sort of historical record. Next up on my list, I have a standard type battleship. So this is another American-centric pick. The United States already has 8 museum battleships. Do we really need another one? I'd argue yes. 7 of our 8 are fast battleships. We've got a North Carolina, we've got 2 of the 4 South Dakotas, 1 of the 2 North Carolinas, and then all 4 of the completed Iowa-class battleships, and only 1 older battleship, Texas. And she is a World War I era dreadnought that predates the quote-unquote standard type that started just one hull after her with Battleship Nevada and continues all the way up until the Washington Naval Treaty cancels the last of the standard type under construction, and then prompts a design shift to the fast battleship generation over 2 decades later. The standard type battleships were the ones that held the line during the interwar period. Some of them served in World War I. The ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were standard type battleships, all of them. And then they survive, some of them in the mothball fleet, into the 50s and even in some cases approaching the 60s, which puts them firmly in the era of museum ships starting to operate. Texas, of course, being the first permanently operating one starting in 1948, and most of the other major museums opening in the early 60s and 70s, with the exception of the 4 Iowas that opened in the 90s and 2000s. So there was the potential there for states to get their battleships. However, relatively landlocked, Pennsylvania, I guess, could bring her to the river here. Maryland, a relatively small state, to bring their battleship home to the Chesapeake. West Virginia and Colorado, those states can't really take their ships. And so for a number of reasons, none of these vessels are preserved. Personally, as a Marylander, I would have loved to have seen Maryland saved. She ended the war the most similarly to her Pearl Harbor configuration. Tennessee and California. Tennessee, of course, wouldn't have been preserved in Tennessee, but California at that point was still a conservative state and has a ton of coastline and a very small number of museum warships compared to, say, a New York or a Pennsylvania, which have more than her. So there's plenty of room for the Battleship California, a survivor of both Pearl Harbor and Saragawa Strait, to have been preserved. Next up, a Perry-class frigate. The Perry class were the last class of frigates built by this country before we decommissioned them all and tried the littoral combat ship boondoggle before going back to frigates with the new Constellation class, which are a whole new generation. But the Perry class is really the final form of an evolutionary process that begins with the World War II era destroyer escorts and ends with them before we go off in new directions using the littoral combat ships, which is a new and dead-end evolutionary stream, and the Constellation class, which we have bought those designs from a foreign country, so a whole new evolutionary design on their own, which will probably continue from there on out. The Perrys are excellent examples of Cold War warships, of which there are very few preserved. They operated in a couple of different countries. I know Australia off the top of my head. So hey, the United States has a ton of museum ships. Maybe Australia could save one of theirs. There might have been some other countries that operated them. There are certainly some other countries that are currently operating them. This is one of the few classes on this list that hey, maybe it can actually happen. I believe there is a group in Erie, Pennsylvania that's trying to save a Perry-class frigate, but I don't know that any are actually on donation hold at this time. And I'm not sure they've specifically said we want to save X frigate or Y frigate. So a Perry-class frigate in particular, maybe I'll settle for any of the Cold War era frigates. That is an interesting type of ship that did interesting work and is completely unrepresented in the museum ship field. And finally, my last choice, a battle cruiser. Capital ships are preserved in a much higher proportion than smaller ships, potentially with the exception of submarines. There are a lot of museum submarines out there. But no battle cruiser has been preserved. And battle cruisers, because of their high speed, were able to get to combat areas quickly and saw some interesting service. By the end of World War II, I can think of 4 battle cruiser or battle cruiser adjacent ships that were still around. That would be HMS Renown in Great Britain, which absolutely should have been preserved. The British were the premier battle cruiser operators, and Renown was the last one left. The former Goeben in Turkey, which was changed into the Sultan Yavuz, a World War I era German battle cruiser, and the last member of the High Seas Fleet in existence, and she survived into the 60s and 70s. And like I said, in my top 10 specific ships, where I included her, Turkey even offered her back to Germany to use as a museum ship, and it was turned down and the ship ended up being scrapped. And then in the United States, we had the large cruisers, Alaska and Guam, which many consider battle cruisers. Those are absolutely gorgeous looking ships with very, very low mileage on them that ended up being scrapped in the 60s in the middle of the museum era. I don't think Alaska or Guam would make great places to display a museum ship or would have the same backing as, say, the state of New Jersey supporting New Jersey, but those would have been interesting ships to save, and it would have also checked a box for World War II cruiser for me. Love those ships, really disappointed they aren't around anymore. So they're going to show up somewhere on just about any of my top 10 lists. So what types of ships are on your top 10 list? Let me know in the comment section down below. I'm interested to hear what you would say. Again, I'm an American historian. The bulk of my view are looking at American ships and things that fill in the American historical record. I know you guys are watching from all over the world. What are some interesting types of ships that you operated or your country's operated or that you would like to be seen? Like, I really want to see what you have down in the comment section. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals. And your support allows us to make fun, speculative videos like this one. This is the sort of stuff I love doing, and your support lets me do it. So thank you for that. Another way you can support us is by liking, sharing, and subscribing. So if you do that, more people find out about our channel and our museum, and that allows us to make more content. So thank you guys for watching. See you next time.